The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March 1962, and it would force Elvis Presley to make the most expensive decision of his career. On the line was the biggest concert promoter in the South, offering Elvis more money than he'd ever been paid for a single performance, $100,000 for one night, equivalent to nearly $1 million today. There was just one condition that the promoter assumed wouldn't be a problem. The audience had to be whites only. What Elvis said next would cost him a fortune, infuriate his manager, and create a controversy that would follow him for the rest of his life. But it would also prove that the king of rock and roll was willing to sacrifice his crown for something more important than money. The proposed concert was to be held at the brand-new Dixie Arena in Atlanta, Georgia, with a capacity of 25,000 people. It would be Elvis's largest Southern audience to date, and the $100,000 fee was 3 times what he typically earned for a single performance. For Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, it seemed like easy money. "Elvis, this is the opportunity of a lifetime," Parker had said, spreading the contract across Elvis's kitchen table at Graceland. $100,000 for 3 hours of work. That's more than most people make in 10 years. Elvis picked up the contract and began reading through the terms. Everything seemed standard until he reached Clause 47, buried in the fine print. Artist agrees that audience shall be restricted to white patrons only. No persons of Negro, Oriental, or other non-Caucasian heritage shall be permitted entry to the venue during the performance. Elvis set the contract down and looked at Parker. "Colonel, what's this clause about?" Parker waved his hand dismissively. "Standard Southern venue policy, Elvis. Nothing unusual. Mackenzie runs a clean operation, keeps trouble to a minimum by maintaining traditional seating arrangements." "Traditional seating arrangements?" Elvis repeated slowly. "You mean segregation?" "I mean business, Elvis. We're not social activists. We're entertainers. Our job is to sing, collect the money, and go home." But Elvis had been thinking about these issues more and more since his rise to fame. He'd grown up poor in Mississippi, where he'd learned to love music by listening to black radio stations and attending black churches when he was welcome. The foundation of his sound came from black musicians, Arthur Crudup, Big Mama Thornton, B.B. King, and countless others who had created the style that made him famous. More troubling to Elvis was the knowledge that many of these musicians couldn't even attend his concerts in certain venues. B.B. King, who had become a friend and musical mentor, had never seen Elvis perform live in the South because he couldn't buy a ticket to a whites-only show. "Colonel, I've been thinking about this for a while," Elvis said. "It doesn't sit right with me anymore. The music I sing, it comes from black musicians. How can I perform it for audiences that won't even let those musicians through the door?" Parker's face darkened. "Elvis, let me explain something to you about the music business. We don't make money by being political. We make money by giving people what they want, and what they want in the South is good music without complications." "Without complications," Elvis said. "You mean without black people?" "I mean without trouble, without controversy, without anything that's going to cost us money or get us banned from venues." Parker leaned forward. "Elvis, this is $100,000 we're talking about. More money than your daddy made in his entire life. Don't throw it away for some abstract principle." Elvis stood up from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds of Graceland. The property had been bought with money he'd earned performing music that was rooted in black culture. Music he'd learned from black musicians who couldn't afford houses like this, who couldn't even attend his concerts. "It's not abstract to me, Colonel. It's personal." Parker tried a different approach. "Elvis, think about your career. Think about your future. If you start turning down major venues because of their policies, word will get around. Other promoters will think twice before booking you. You could price yourself out of entire markets. Maybe that's a price I'm willing to pay." The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Parker growing increasingly frustrated and Elvis becoming more resolved. Finally, Parker played his trump card. "Elvis, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you willing to throw away your career over this?" Elvis was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up the contract, walked to his desk, and pulled out a pen. For a moment, Parker thought he was going to sign it. Instead, Elvis wrote across the bottom of the contract, "I cannot in good conscience perform for a segregated audience. Thank you for the offer, but I must decline. Elvis Presley. Elvis, what have you done? Parker said, his voice rising. The right thing, Elvis replied. The decision to refuse the Atlanta contract had immediate consequences. Within hours of Mackenzie receiving Elvis's response, the story had spread through the entertainment industry. Southern promoters who had been courting Elvis for major venue bookings suddenly went silent. Radio stations in certain markets began reducing their rotation of Elvis records. But the most painful reaction came from some of Elvis's own fans. Letters poured into Graceland, many expressing disappointment, anger, and in some cases, outright hatred. One letter that particularly affected Elvis read, "You have betrayed everything we believed about you. We thought you were one of us, but you've chosen them over your own people." Elvis spent hours reading these letters, trying to understand how people could see his decision as a betrayal rather than a matter of basic human decency. He called his friend Red West, who had known him since high school. "Red, am I crazy?" Elvis asked. "Am I throwing everything away for nothing?" "Elvis, I've known you since we were kids," Red replied, "and I've never seen you do anything that wasn't true to who you are inside. If this feels right to you, then it's right." But the doubt was eating at Elvis. Colonel Parker was pressuring him daily to reconsider, to call Mackenzie and negotiate a compromise. "Maybe we could have a segregated section for black attendees," Parker suggested. "Separate but equal seating." "Separate but equal isn't equal, Colonel," Elvis said, "and you know it." The pressure intensified when Mackenzie himself called Graceland. "Mr. Presley," Mackenzie said, "I respect your position, but I think you're misunderstanding the situation. This isn't about hatred. This is about maintaining order, keeping our audiences comfortable. If you integrate the audience, you're asking for trouble. Fights, riots, problems that nobody wants." "Mr. Mackenzie," Elvis replied, "with all due respect, the only trouble I see is the trouble we create by treating people differently based on the color of their skin." "That's idealistic, son, but it's not realistic. You can't change the South overnight." "Maybe not, but I don't have to participate in keeping it the same." Mackenzie made one final offer. "I'll increase the fee to $125,000, and I'll donate $25,000 to a Negro charity of your choice. That way, you're actually helping black people while still performing for our traditional audience." The offer was tempting in its apparent reasonableness. Elvis could earn more money than he'd ever made, and Mackenzie would donate a significant sum to help black communities. It seemed like a win-win situation. But Elvis recognized it for what it was, a way to buy his conscience, to allow him to feel good about participating in segregation, because money would go to a good cause. It was the kind of compromise that would let him sleep at night while still maintaining the system he objected to. "Mr. Mackenzie, I appreciate the offer, but my answer is still no. I won't perform for a segregated audience, no matter how much you pay me or how much you donate." Word of Elvis's refusal spread beyond the music industry and into the broader civil rights conversation. The story was picked up by newspapers across the country, with reactions falling along predictable lines based on the political leanings of the publications and their readers. The Atlanta Constitution ran an editorial titled "Elvis Presley's Expensive Conscience," which criticized his decision as grandstanding and predicted that his career would suffer for putting politics ahead of entertainment. But the Chicago Defender, a prominent black newspaper, ran a front-page story with the headline, "Elvis Presley Puts Principles Before Profit," praising his decision and calling it a sign that even in the Deep South, consciences are stirring. The most significant response came from an unexpected source: Martin Luther King Jr. himself. Dr. King, who rarely commented on entertainment industry matters, issued a statement through the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. "Mr. Presley's decision to refuse a segregated performance demonstrates that the moral awakening we are witnessing in America extends beyond the obvious leaders of the civil rights movement. When someone with Mr. Presley's influence and economic incentives chooses principle over profit, it sends a powerful message that segregation is morally indefensible, even to those who benefit from it." The statement was picked up by national news outlets and transformed Elvis's decision from an entertainment industry story into a civil rights milestone. Suddenly, Elvis found himself thrust into a role he had never sought, civil rights symbol. The financial consequences were severe. Colonel Parker estimated that Elvis lost at least $500,000 in booking opportunities over the following year as Southern promoters became wary of working with him. Several planned television appearances were canceled. Radio airplay in certain markets dropped significantly. But there were positive consequences as well. Northern venues that had been hesitant to book Elvis suddenly became interested. College campuses began inviting him to perform. Most importantly, Elvis began receiving letters of support from black musicians. B.B. King wrote, "Elvis, you stood up when you didn't have to, when it cost you something real. That means more to me and to everyone in our community than I can put into words." The decision also opened doors that had been previously closed. Elvis was invited to perform at integrated venues that had been off-limits before. He began receiving requests to appear at civil rights fundraisers and benefit concerts. While he generally avoided explicitly political events, he did agree to perform at several concerts where proceeds went to civil rights organizations. Perhaps most significantly, Elvis's refusal to perform for segregated audiences became a model for other white entertainers. Within 6 months of his decision, 3 other major performers had made similar stands, refusing lucrative contracts that required segregated audiences. The entertainment industry began to take notice. Venue owners who had maintained segregation policies found themselves losing bookings as performers followed Elvis's lead. The economic pressure created by artists refusing to participate in segregation proved more effective than legal challenges in some cases. By 1965, Marcus Mackenzie's empire of segregated venues was crumbling. Unable to book major acts who insisted on integrated audiences, he was forced to change his policies or go out of business. He chose to integrate, publicly crediting Elvis's 1962 decision as the beginning of the change. "I was wrong," Mackenzie said in a 1965 interview. "I thought I was protecting my business, but I was really just protecting an old way of thinking. Elvis Presley showed me that you could make money and do the right thing at the same time." The Dixie Arena, where Elvis had been offered $100,000 to perform for a whites-only audience, reopened in 1964 as an integrated venue. Its first major concert featured Elvis Presley performing for an audience of all races, earning his standard fee of $35,000, much less than the original offer, but infinitely more valuable to him personally. Elvis never publicly discussed the financial cost of his 1962 decision, but those close to him estimated that it cost him well over $1 million in lost bookings and reduced fees over his career. When asked about it in a 1968 interview, Elvis simply said, "Some things are more important than money." The decision had a profound effect on Elvis's relationship with black musicians in the broader civil rights community. He was invited to perform at the 1963 March on Washington, though he declined to avoid making the event about entertainment rather than civil rights. He did, however, make substantial anonymous donations to civil rights organizations throughout the 1960s. B.B. King became a frequent guest at Graceland, and Elvis often sought his advice on racial issues. Elvis genuinely wanted to understand, King said in later interviews. He knew he had benefited from black music, and he wanted to make sure he was giving back in the right way. The 1962 contract refusal also marked the beginning of a more complicated relationship between Elvis and Colonel Parker. Parker never forgave Elvis for what he saw as a financially disastrous decision, and their working relationship was never quite the same. Some biographers suggest that this conflict contributed to the increasing control Parker exercised over Elvis's career in later years. Elvis continued to face consequences for his decision throughout his career. Several Southern venues remained closed to him well into the 1970s. Some radio stations in certain markets never fully forgave him. But Elvis seemed to accept these costs as the price of maintaining his principles. In 1973, 11 years after refusing the Atlanta contract, Elvis was asked in an interview whether he regretted the decision. "Never," he said immediately, "not for 1 second. That money would have been spent and forgotten by now. But knowing I did the right thing, that's something I carry with me every day." The 1962 contract refusal became legendary in civil rights circles, often cited as an example of how individuals with privilege could advance justice. When Elvis died in 1977, obituaries in black newspapers mentioned his decision alongside his musical achievements. The original contract, with Elvis's handwritten refusal, was donated to the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. It remains on display today, a reminder of a moment when one person's decision helped change an industry and advance justice. The story serves as a reminder that moral progress often comes from individual choices made by people in positions of power. Elvis didn't have to refuse that contract. He could have taken the money and justified it to himself. Instead, he chose to sacrifice immediate financial gain for long-term moral integrity. In March 1962, Elvis Presley was offered $100,000 to perform for a whites-only audience. He said no, and in doing so, he proved that the king of rock and roll was willing to give up his crown for something more valuable than money, the knowledge that he had done the right thing regardless of the cost.